Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Flower Farming Science class, where today we're going to focus specifically on dahlias. We are going to get into the weeds, and if you're someone who likes to nerd out to understand the why behind things, this is the video for you, because we're going to talk specifically about how light or photoperiod and temperature impacts dahlias. So this topic all came about when I went to the ASCFG Northeast conference about 2 months ago and heard a talk given by Dr. Alakane Carlson. Now, Dr. Carlson is a name that you might recognize. She's one of the authors of this very famous book that many of us have. I kind of use it as a Bible. But anyway, she's the head of marketing at Syngenta, where they breed the Karma series of dahlias, which also includes Cafe au lait. And she did a very interesting presentation talking about these two topics. So although I can't share her specific slides, I can share what she talked about. And it really made me realize that even though I don't grow dahlias in high numbers, I realized that really understanding the why behind certain things gave me a much better understanding of why certain things go wrong, or why people recommend things like, why do you have to get your tubers in when the soil is 60 degrees or above? Why do I have to get them in late summer, right? Like, hypothetically, I know the answer, but now I know like more details around it. And so if you're a Patreon member, there's going to be an accompanying article with a lot more specifics, including some more scientific studies. But at the end of this video, we're actually going to go inside and look at some studies that Dr. Carlson didn't reference, but that I was able to find, that is going to help wrap everything together and help you hopefully grow better dahlias. Let's start off with this concept of photoperiod and define what it is. Photoperiod simply is just how much light is there in a day. And another way to think about this is how much light is there in the day versus at night. So what is the hours of daytime versus nighttime? And this is really important because every plant has different preferences or needs in terms of how many day length hours they want. And the day length hours might impact things like vegetative growth or even getting things like buds. So how do we separate out photoperiods? You've got like long day, day neutral, short day. And what this basically means is that there are certain flowers that prefer the longer day lengths, certain flowers that are day neutral. So sunflowers are a good example of that. I have yet to find something that is like truly day neutral, but sunflowers are the closest to that. I talked about long day. Typically, your warm loving annuals are long day, meaning that if you don't grow them during the long days of the summer, we're talking about like 12 plus hours, then things are not going to do well for you. And then you get to short day. So short day means that these flowers want to be grown under short day conditions. You've got some flowers that actually will only flower when it gets longer days, such as like ranunculus, but you have to start them a bit earlier because temperature comes into play. So you can see that there's two main variables that might play into a specific crop's behavior, and you need to understand how those two variables go together in order to maximize your outcome. So we'll get to temperature later, but if we focus on photoperiod, dahlias belong to the short day photoperiod bucket. Now, within each of these photoperiods, there's of course more subsegments. So dahlias here are facultative short day, which means they prefer short days. They prefer the shorter days in order to initiate buds. Now, many of us have definitely gotten buds during the height of summer when there are longer days, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they are facultative short day. The contrast to that is actually something called obligative short day, which means that they have to have short days in order to flower. Most dahlia varieties are not obligates. They are facultative short days, and with modern breeding, they're trying to diversify that out so that that the dahlias are not just confined to these short days. In the presentation at ASCFG, Dr. Carlson gave a specific date range that was September 20th to March 20th as being that short day window. Now, within that date range, you also hit something called Persephone phase, which is where you get under 10 hours of sunlight a day. And when you hit that phase, which is usually somewhere around November for most of us, that's a time where plants go dormant. They can't really grow at all. If they're still alive, they're preserving their energy to stay alive, but they're really waiting out winter before the conditions are better for them to start blooming. So what that means is that Dr. Carlson is saying that from September 20th to your first frost is really the most ideal time for dahlias from a light perspective, because they have those short days to really indicate to the plant to start flowering. And a little bit of the why behind that. So plants, especially trees, really use photoperiod as a signal to say, oh, fall is coming. I need to start storing my sugars, my nutrients into my roots, and then therefore my leaves can fall off. So obviously plants don't shed leaves, but if you think about what is a plant's primary objective, it is to reproduce. So in order to reproduce, a plant needs to set flower, and that flower can eventually set seed. So to initiate that process, the plant is saying, oh, I see that fall is coming from a lack of light, triggering the growth for these bloom heads, and then these bloom heads will eventually turn into seed. So this is why in the summer, when you get really, really hot temperatures that are not traditional to fall, your trees are still more or less on the same timeline to turn yellow and fall. So it's not just temperature based, a lot of it really is photoperiod based as a signal for nature to initiate the next part of its life cycle. So if dahlias want shorter day periods to initiate flower growth, you're probably asking yourself, like I did, why do we need to get them in the ground so early in spring? Because they take up a lot of space in the ground, and I feel like we're always in a rush to get them in. So the reason is because during the height of summer, where the days are the longest, dahlias are focusing on putting on vegetative growth. So this is a time where they're growing shoots, they're growing grains, and they're growing roots. The studies have shown that the strength of the root system and how much foliage it grows is correlated or proportional to the productivity of the ultimate dahlia. So this is why for me, I try to get in my dahlias sometime like late April, latest Mother's Day. So that would be like early mid May for where we are in the United States in the Northeast. And if I can get in at that time, the soil temperature is close to 60 degrees and the dahlias are going to be able to do their thing and really put on some vigorous growth. If I were to get the dahlias in later, let's say in like later June, it's not that you can't get flowering dahlias. It's that you're probably going to get less vigorous dahlia blooms. So meaning your plant itself is probably going to be a little bit smaller. It's going to put up a few blooms, but if you want to get a high productivity, and you can see over here, I've got quite a few dahlia heads popping up. This is the second flush of, I would say, like good cuttings that I'm going to get off of them at once. You wouldn't be able to achieve this likely if you put in your dahlia tubers too late. So that's why you have to hurry along in the spring. Now let's talk about temperature. And I think the best way to think about how to maximize a crop's potential is to think about, where does that plant originate from? So dahlias here originate from Mexico, where the days are warm and the nights are cool. And that's why dahlias are technically a late summer, early fall crop. I think a lot of beginner growers think that they're a summer crop. They're actually not. They hit their stride this time of year when we get those cooler nights. So the sweet spot for dahlias during the day is somewhere in like the mid 70s to maybe mid 80-degree Fahrenheit range. And then at night, we're talking about the low 60s, like 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So when the daytime temperatures get too hot, it actually not only impacts the flower quantity, but it also impacts the flower quality. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. When the nights get too cool, similar to most other plants, it's going to have an impact on the speed of flowering, meaning the plants is just not going to produce those buds as quickly as they would if they were in that sweet range of like 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So after this piece, we're going to go back in and talk or bring in the scientific studies to kind of round this all out and combine temperature and photoperiod. But before we go there, I do want to talk about overwintering. So where I am here in New Jersey in 7A, we're technically on the cusp of being able to overwinter. I've seen other flower farmers here overwinter, and it's not that they can't successfully overwinter the dahlias. It's the fact that the dahlias produce very poor quality blooms. If anything, they are overtaken by pests. And while there are no scientific studies out there that I can find around this, what I can hypothesize is that the tubers are in the ground. They're getting a much earlier start to growing. So they're putting on more vegetative growth, more stems more quickly. And even though dahlias are facultative short day flowers, meaning they prefer short days, they can still flower under these long day conditions if they're ready. So my hypothesis is that they're growing a little too quickly for what their natural conditions are, and growing too quickly as a plant is not always a good thing. So if you've ever grown seedlings and you've over fertilized them and they're just like growing really, really fast, and then you transplant them out and they start getting overtaken by bugs and all that stuff, like that might actually be a sign that the plant just grew too fast and doesn't actually have as healthy of a system in order to like repel disease as well as bugs. But not only that, the height of summer is when there are the most amount of pests. So here where I am, the Japanese beetle, thrips, those are common things that you would see with dahlias that you would technically avoid if you got them to bloom at this time of year. This time of year, thrips are basically gone. The Japanese beetle has been gone for about a month by now. And really what you'd be battling is a tarnished plant bug. Photoperiod will also have an impact on certain varieties in terms of how quickly and when they flower. So we find that the ball flowering varieties are a little bit more earlier to flower than the bigger decorative dahlias like a cafe au lait. And I definitely see it here in my little patch. So this is Cornell bronze, and what I had done this past year was I basically focused on growing like 6 varieties to get a lot at once. And I would say that the Cornell bronze has been super, super productive. Every single week I can get blooms, but every 2 weeks or so I can get a ton of blooms like this, where it makes it easier for me to sell to wholesale. Now take another example here. This is more of a decorative type. This is called Westerton Lillian. It's one of my favorite dahlias. The problem with this dahlia is that it takes freaking forever for it to mature. In fact, I got my first bloom last week, and it takes a long time to flower. It takes a long time for these petals to open. It does make it more susceptible to pest damage. I know people are going to say organza bag it. I honestly don't have the time to do it. And I'm kind of growing this more for me than anything else. But you can see, like, finally getting 3 total flowers versus having gotten at this point like dozens of the ball dahlias. So this has implications for you if you live in a much cooler climate where you're going to get a frost much earlier than me. You might be getting a frost like 3-4 weeks in advance of me. We are already in mid-September. There's certain places that are going to get a frost pretty soon. If you're trying to grow a big decorative variety such as a Westerton Lillian or a Cafe au lait, you are going to be caught in this place where a frost might just happen to take out a flowering dahlia that you've waited so long for. So this is why variety selection is really, really important, especially if you don't live in a zone or a climate that is conducive for growing dahlias. And so typically that is, I would say, like zones 5 and under are ones where you really, really need to pay attention. And so there's a lot more hybridized varieties right now, and all of them typically you should be able to find some sort of culture sheet or information around what their blooming time habits are, days to blooming, that kind of stuff. And you should be able to triangulate back to see which variety works best for you. This here is Chilson's Pride. I actually don't know if Chilson's Pride is a decorative or a cactus dahlia, but clearly much smaller than a Cafe au lait or Westerton Lillian. Chilson's Pride just happens to be a very productive tuber producer as well as bloom producer. And so I've already gotten about a dozen blooms off of these 2 plants alone. And I find that Chilson's Pride actually produces flowers a lot more quickly and abundantly than something like a Cornell bronze, right? So not all dahlias are created equal. Not all varieties are created equal. Sometimes it's really a matter of you experimenting to see which one is going to do the best for you. Like, I didn't even think I was going to have enough to sell wholesale tomorrow, but I might. I mean, this one's a half one, but yeah, you can see just how quickly. And like, I would say that all of this had buds about 5 days ago and have now opened up beautifully for it to be sellable. New day, and we are going to head into the science portion looking at a couple of studies to round things out. But before we do so, we're going to change things up in this video. I'm actually going to do a quick update on E right now, and I do have a favor to ask of the flower community, and I'm hoping that we can come together and make a really big impact together.
you dancing? We are now back inside next to my computer where we're going to review a study that was done in 1993 looking at the impact of photoperiod and temperatures on a specific dahlia cultivar called Royal Dahliata Yellow. Now, one of the limitations with a lot of dahlia studies is that they're actually looking more at landscaping type of dahlias. So we're talking about shorter, compact plants that are not necessarily bred for cutting. But I do think that some of these takeaways are very useful for us as flower farmers, and hopefully this part of this video can provide more context to what we just talked about earlier in the field. The study did support what we talked earlier, which was that longer day lengths are definitely correlated with vegetative growth, and shorter days don't promote those lateral shoots that are really important for us wanting to achieve more buds. Now, what this study actually talked about in detail was tuber formation, which is something that we didn't cover out in the field. And I think that this piece can be really important and relevant for those of you out there who are either propagating to sell your dahlia tubers or you're trying to increase your stock. So the premise is that shorter days actually promote tuber formation. Tuber formation is not necessarily driven by how many leaves the plant has or just how bushy the growth of the plant is. Tuber formation is more or less initiated by day length. So shorter days really help promote tuber formation. Now, if you are someone who is buying in cuttings and this is early spring and you're trying to make sure that these cuttings are going to grow into these big, bushy, healthy plants, you want to make sure that you are supplementing lighting for these plants, especially at a time when the natural day length may not be long enough because the plants are going to be triggered into wanting to focus their energy on creating tubers. And I think this is why sometimes when we start dahlias from seed and we're not giving them enough day length, you start seeing a lot of tubers starting to form. And that's totally fine. But what you really want to do is you want to encourage the plant to put as much of its energy into growing vegetative growth. So alternatively, if you're someone who didn't get your dahlias into the ground much later into the season, and you're not going to get as many flowers, but you have a primary goal of wanting to propagate the amount of tubers that you have to have a bigger stock for next year, the time in that soil and the space that you're using is not going to be wasted because you can make sure that the tubers are going to stay in the ground until the fall, where it will definitely be able to create more tubers for you to use next year. In addition to these shorter days, the study also found that lower temperatures, so we're talking about in the range of like 60 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, also really helped encourage root development as well as tuber formation. So again, this goes back to early spring where you get these cuttings in earlier in the season, you're trying to propagate them. The temperature is inherently going to be a little bit cooler. All of these are signals for the plant to start putting on tuber formation. So you might want to also put something like a heat mat on to make sure that the dahlia is thinking, hey, I'm getting supplemental lighting, I'm getting supplemental heating, it must be summer, and therefore I want to make sure that I am putting on vegetative growth. If we step away from tuber formation, the study then showed that flower size and count definitely are correlated with temperature. So both flower count and the diameter, or how big the flower is, decreased as the average temperature increased. So high temperatures definitely negatively affected flower development, and the optimal conditions for the fastest development, most flowers and largest blooms were basically around the 12 to 14 hour photoperiod and temperatures around 68 degrees. So that is for where I live, sometime in like the late August to late September timeframe, which is exactly in line with my personal experience of when I can get the best dahlias. One other thing that I want to talk about is, why do dahlia tubers need to be planted in the soil at 60 degrees Fahrenheit or above? That's about 15.5 degrees Celsius. I've always wondered about this. This study didn't talk about it, but I looked at other research, and basically the reason is because you need the soil to be around 60 degrees Fahrenheit to promote the necessary metabolic processes for successful sprouting and growth. And the reason is because enzymatic activity, so that is specific to starch conversion in tubers, accelerates in warmer soils, and that typically happens around the 60-degree mark. If you are planting below 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the soil, that can slow or inhibit root formation and overall sprouting. And so what happens is, if the tubers are just sitting there and then there is a lot of water, the tubers are going to begin to rot. So this is why getting your tubers in too early is not going to be good, because you're going to increase the chances of them rotting since they're not going to sprout. But if you wait till after the soil is above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, then you have a much higher chance of them quickly sprouting and therefore not rotting, even if you get a high amount of rainfall. I hope you found this science and data-backed video as interesting as I did when I was researching it, and helps you grow better dahlias. If you're a Patreon member, be sure to check out the accompanying article. I do talk a little bit more about cafe au laits and how you can make sure you're maximizing getting the best types of blooms out of them, because sometimes what happens is you get those single varieties, and I explain why that happens. So let me know in the comments if you have any questions, whether or not what I talked about aligns with your experiences, and I'll see you in the next video.